Well, good morning, everybody, and thanks very much for joining our session. I think it's true to say that there's a tremendous interest in agroforestry, and that's really demonstrated by there having been at least 5 other sessions as part of this conference focusing on agroforestry, integrating trees into the farm system. And that's really fantastic. And what we want to do in this session is really to provide an update on our project, to look at the potential to capitalize on that interest and encourage wide-scale uptake under the Environmental Land Management ELM scheme. So I should say at the outset, this is quite England focused. It is about ELM, but obviously I think there's some sort of parallel kind of lessons and relevant issues that of course are important for the developed nations and indeed internationally as well. But just to make that clear at the beginning, we are talking about the environmental land management and its implementation in England. So in the next 1.5 hours, what we're going to do, we're going to describe the project as a whole, its approach, and summarize a few of the sort of high-level findings from that. We'll hear from one of our monitor farmers, Paul Renison, about his experience of agroforestry in practice, in that case, upland silvopasture. And then my colleagues on the project are going to each take one of the key issues that have been sort of, in a sense, coming up again and again through the course of our project. And these issues are really about things that need to be worked through in order to design a scheme that will encourage uptake of agroforestry through ELM. So each of them will briefly describe that issue and some of the perspectives that we've been hearing about on that. But importantly, we're going to be inviting some comment and discussion from all of you about those issues. So in a sense, we see this session as a bit of our evidence gathering for this our project. So I hope you're all up for that, and we're really encourage you to participate and to give us your perspectives, whether or not you're actually practicing agroforestry. We're interested to hear from you, and that's going to be the bit that's really useful to us, but we trust obviously interesting to you as well. Just in terms of a little bit more of housekeeping things, as I first of all introduce the project, and then as Paul speaks, do feel free to post any questions in the chat, and hopefully there'll be some time after those 2 bits of our session for us to look at those questions and come back to you. And then for the interactive discussion part, I'll say a little bit more about how we intend to sort of manage that later on. Okay, so just moving on then to talk about the project as a whole. So as part of Defra's test and trials process to co-design with farmers and other stakeholders the options that are going to become available under ELM across its 3 components, we have this project, the Agroforestry Test Project, which began just over a year ago in late 2020, and it runs through until early 2023. It's led by the Organic Research Centre, where I work, and alongside the Solid Association and Woodland Trust and Abacus Agriculture. And as we go along, we're keeping in touch with Defra about the results as they're sort of, in a sense, coming in live. We're focusing in this project on 2 of the 5 kind of policy areas that are important for the tests and trials. First one is advice and guidance, so looking at questions such as what information do farmers need to practice agroforestry, from where should that information come, who should actually deliver that advice and guidance, and how can the quality of that advice be assured. So there's advice and guidance as a policy area, and then there's also payment incentives as the second main area. So looking at questions such as what should an agroforestry option under ELM offer participants? Should it be about payments for activities or outcomes, or both? And if outcomes, how should those payments be triggered? To inform the work, right at the beginning, we did an evidence review. This was essentially a literature review of what has been learned in the past about the barriers and opportunities to agroforestry practice in the UK, identified by previous projects, such as some of the European collaborations that I dare say many of you will have perhaps heard about. The Agroforestry Innovation Network, AFANET, is one example. So there's quite a lot of work has been done into that within the UK and Europe, and we brought that information together, looking at some of the issues around lack of available knowledge. That was certainly one of the key ones, but also the funding opportunity, or lack of, and issues around the sort of capital and establishment costs, for example, of setting up an agroforestry system. So that was the kind of groundwork which then informs the rest of the project. Then we went about setting up 6 regional clusters. In each one there was one monitor farmer and 5 cluster farms. And the idea was for each of these clusters to focus on a different type of agroforestry. So we have in the east silvoarable focus, and the southwest silvohorticulture. In the central area, silvopoultry, then lowland silvopasture in the Woodlands, upland silvopasture in the northwest, and then woodland grazing and wood pasture in the southeast. We carried out interviews with the participating farmers in each of these clusters to gather baseline data. And then at the heart of the project, and what we've been doing over the last few months, is holding a series of regional workshops, one in each of these regions and clusters, so hosted by a monitor farmer. And so, you know, given the opportunity to actually to see agroforestry in practice and to talk about that. But then in the course of the one-day workshop, to actually explore some of the kind of key issues about, or in a sense, the building blocks for what are needed to encourage uptake of agroforestry in the future under Elm. We'll hear from one of the host monitor farmers in a minute, as I said, from Paul. And then we'll be honing in on some of the kind of, well, 3 key issues that have been coming up again and again. But I just wanted to quickly summarize some of the kind of key findings and messages that have been coming up in these workshops. So these are just high-level sort of headings, really, just to give you a flavor for the issues that we really need to kind of sort out in terms of designing agroforestry options. So firstly, real desire and need for flexibility, both in terms of flexibility of design, so that it's adapted to local conditions and avoids any unintended sort of negative outcomes, but also flexibility in how the system is able to evolve, basically. So a farmer may want to sort of follow different courses or evolutions of the agroforestry, which is, you know, as you know, a kind of a fairly long-term proposition. So there's that kind of flexibility was one of the key things that was coming out again and again in our workshops. The need for different types of advice, perhaps more so than many or some other areas of farming. There's knowledge needed about the kind of practical considerations of, you know, planting trees, choosing which trees, establishing them, and then protecting them and maintaining them, etc. All of that, but also the kind of business proposition, the markets, the profitability of agroforestry systems, and also maximizing the public goods, the environmental benefits as well. So there's all these kind of different areas of knowledge which are required to implement agroforestry successfully. And that has implications about how you actually source that knowledge and information. So I think clearly the kind of peer-to-peer learning side of things, the value of on-farm advice giving, of local demonstration farms, that was universally accepted as being really important. But also there's an increasing kind of richness of online resources as well, and we were kind of exploring what those are. I think another key message is about allowing for different levels of ambition. So one can imagine a sort of more of an entry level scheme, but also higher payments being made available for achieving better public goods outcomes when there's evidence for that, or perhaps for farmers to participate in kind of more in-depth kind of monitoring of results and into research, ongoing research as well. But then one of the things to think about is how to measure those outcomes, and this is, you know, not an easy question. So, you know, there's been discussion about needing a pragmatic and scalable approach, but also one that does encompass and reflect the different kinds of environmental improvement that agroforestry can give, the different public goods that can be delivered. So that's just to kind of give you a flavour there of yeah, what we've been sort of discovering. So at this point, I'd like to hand over to Paul, our monitor farmer in the northwest in Cumbria, really to give us all a bit kind of an example of agroforestry in practice and some of the issues that he's been tackling in doing so. So Paul, over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Will, for that introduction. Just going to give you a little overview of what we're up to here in Cumbria. So we're a small family farm. We've moved to this farm. It's called Chesshire Farm in Rennick, near Penrith on the East Fell side. And we came here with a quite traditional mindset to begin with. And over the years, we've moved to a more sort of farming with nature kind of outlook. And with that in mind, we've reduced our sheep numbers from over 1,000 to 200. We've now got a suckler herd of 65 cows, where we farm in rotation. So behind the cows, about 3 or 4 days behind the cows, we've got an eggmobile that comes in. And so that's helping with our stacking of enterprises and things. And then we're also doing meat chickens. We do up to 1,000 meat birds a year in Joel Salatin style chicken tractors. We're also trying a few different things with bale grazing, and we've moved from silage bale grazing now to hay bale grazing. You can see in that top right picture in the corner there. And so we're extending our grazing season. And with that comes the need for extra tree cover, hedges and things, just because we're finding we're getting extremes of weather now. In the summer, we're getting droughts, long droughts, and in the winter, we're getting these really bad storms that are coming through. So with that in mind, that's kind of our thinking now long term is to try and get more trees and hedges in the area. So so that's also building in resilience to the business. So that our main consideration really is the wind and the storms. And also we're looking now at fodder for the cattle. So they're going to be self-medicating on these crops down our alleyways we're making with trees and hedges. So can I have the next slide, please, Will? This is just a picture of our cows on rotation. Most of our fields are sort of 6-acre blocks, and they're surrounded mainly with stone walls, and there are some trees, but it's quite a treeless location. And so now we're trying to get the hedges in sorry, I'll start again. Getting a bit nervous. We've done a lot of subdivision with electric fencing, and now we split our 6-acre fields into 3-acre fields, and where we've traditionally put our subdivision with our electric fencing, we're thinking, because we've been doing this for quite a few years now, we know whereabouts we want to put more permanent subdivision with hedges for more wind and just shelter for the animals. So if we move on to the next slide, we can see our second lot of hedging that we did. This was originally an 8-acre field, and we split it in half, created 2 4-acre paddocks. And in the middle of this is a north to south lying hedge. And we went for lots and lots of diversity in this hedge. We've got field maple, bird cherry, holly, hawthorn, lots of hawthorn. There's oaks and hazel and a bit of willow. And so we're splitting all our fields up now, and we're trying to, it's quite a long process, but we're trying to go forward and try and do more of this in the future. So onto the next field, onto the next sort of picture, sorry. There we go. Sorry, I should have said in that last one, we had a lot of help from the Woodland Trust, and they've given us all these trees and all the guards and things. So we work alongside with a really good guy called Pete Leeson in our area, and he's also given us a lot of advice and help with planting as well. So if we move on to the next one, there we go. So this is the first lot of hedging we did under the high level stewardship, and what was just single fencing, splitting up all the fields, is now double fence, so it's really stock proof. And we made a sod cast in the middle of the hedge. Before the fence went in, we got a digger in, scraped up a mound, and planted all the trees on the sod cast, and we got a tremendous uptake and survivability from that, because I suppose the trees weren't competing against any weeds or any grasses. They were just planted into bare soil, and the roots seemed to go down. This is just my theory, but I'm sure it's true that the roots went down deeper, and they just set off really well. So we are just about to lay this hedge. It's 2014 it went in there, so it's doing really well. And with this hedge, we put in a lot of north-south lying hedges, and also east to west as well. So some of the fields that previously didn't have any shelter whatsoever have now got shelter on both sides. So that's been a real bonus. And the other thing about this as well, we're creating these corridors for wildlife, and we're stock proofing the farm and just creating a lot more diversity. So on to the next slide, please, Will. This is a picture of the general sort of typical landscape where we are in the North Pennines. Although that you can see there's a few trees here, but it's fairly treeless area. And we've got these stone walls and things, and that is pretty well historically the only kind of real shelter there's been for livestock in this area, apart from these Sitka spruce plantations, these kind of monocultures, which in Storm Arwen has proved kind of disastrous because an awful lot of them have been very, very badly damaged. So my theory is, going forward, if we're going to put in some more of these woods, we need to make sure they're mixed species. So it's sort of, the wind gets broken up before it gets into them. So on to the next slide, please, Will. So we keep on moving on and trying different things every year. And I started getting very excited by Richard Perkins and looking at all these different things that are going on different farms around the world, and thinking about the browseability of different things. And I started noticing that crab apples, cows would go up to crab apples and eat the leaves, and once the crab apples were there and they were on the floor, they go around and just hoovering up all the crab apples. So there's obviously something that they wanted, like the tannins or the minerals that they needed from all these trees. And I thought, well, if we can get more of them into our pastures, it's going to be good for wildlife, and it's ultimately good for the cattle as well. So with that in mind, we thought we'd be a little bit crazy and put in a browseable hedge on both sides of this. And also the other thing, this is a lot wider than a traditional hedge. A lot of the ones we put in have been about 7 foot wide, and this is 5 meters wide. And we've got a hedge on either side, and then three laneways of trees. So in the hedge, we've got on the outside line, we've got willow and hazel, and then we've got hawthorn and things like dog rose and things. And then the first line of trees, we've got crab apples, we've got aspens, rowans, and bird cherries. And so that, with a view to them growing up and then drooping over the fence, and then the cattle are going to be able to browse on the low-lying branches. And then on the inside row, we've got oak and silver birch. And in the future, we're going to use a silver birch as a bit of a nurse crop, and then cut them out later on as a timber crop, and let the oaks just grow on. So yeah, we've got the browseability. We've also got wood chip potential in there. If we could go along there and coppice most things in there, and we could get wood chip, which we're trying to use now in our bedding as well, to try and get more of a fungal element to our muck that we're spreading. And this now has led me on to reading a bit more about from different people. There's a guy in America called Mark Fletcher, some of you may have heard of, and we've started getting quite interested in permaculture now. And now we've put these things in and we see how well they've done. We're now thinking that in any of the hedges, all the hedges that we do in the future, we'd like to have more apples growing in there, some cherries, that's if we could get them growing around here, but things like gooseberries and things like that growing in these hedges so that humans can go in there and graze on them as well. And although they may not be on a large scale, it means that there's still some more interest for people. We've got people coming now and staying in our glamping units. So if the glamping units are parked up in these fields, they can go there and harvest some nice fruit. So next slide, please. Well, this is one of the last tours we did around the farm, and we're looking at cactus tree guards. And then we've got the boxes, our tree boxes that we put in. The Woodland Trust very kindly donated to us and supplied. So the cactus tree guards, they've been really good. You can get a tree and a couple of hawthorns in there, or whatever you want to put in. The sheep, there's no wool on them or anything, so the sheep don't go anywhere near them. Don't seem to itch on them. They're just too spiky for them. And the cattle, we've watched the cattle around them, and they just keep off them really. The only problem we've had with them is when there's either been a bulling incident or a stampede, whether they may have got spooked by a low-flying aircraft or something, and one of them got slightly damaged. But other than that, we've been very pleased with those. And then the Woodland Trust boxes, you can get more things growing in them. They're more of a sort of a focal point in a way, but they do get a little bit damaged. A bull has a good old itch on those. But the main thing about these in-field tree guards is that having now planted all these wildlife corridors around the farm, we want to get more of these boxes in to try and get more of the birds it's connectivity of all the tree lanes that we've got. So they're basically, there's somewhere for them to land and then rest and then take off and fly onto the next corridor. So the next slide, please, Will. And then this is the last slide. We've got a few wet woodlands which are quite open, and we thought, well, it's an opportunity to get more stuff in. So we've gone for aspen and alder, and also you can just see there's one on the left-hand side there of the picture. We chose quite thick willows, and we've shoved them in the ground as far as we could and left them like a 1.2, 1.5 meters high. And this just allows them to get away basically before the roe deer come in and annihilate them. And they've got away really well. And it seems to be a great way of getting more trees into the landscape, and a cheap way and quite a regenerative way, because there's no plastic involved. So that's what we're on with now. And basically we're trying to find anywhere on the farm that we haven't put into trees and hedges, and we're just trying to keep on finding more of these areas where we can get more of this stuff put in. So I'll hand it back to you, Will. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Paul. That was really really great, and I personally really enjoyed having a chance to see all this in person when we had our workshop up at your farm, and the way that you and Nick showed us around and explained all that was tremendously helpful for the discussion that we then went on to have. We are running a few minutes ahead of schedule, so we do have a few minutes for any questions. I think particularly on the pools we've just been talking about. If you'd like to ask anything, that just put a little message in chat so I can call you in. Whilst you're thinking about that, there is a comment or question here from Bill Knight. Thanks for that, Bill. And you're talking about an issue of agroforestry potentially changing landscape character, or perception that might be kind of a problem in some cases. And this is the example of from Dartmoor, North Devon, etc., and asking whether this kind of pushback has been experienced by anyone else. I don't know, has anybody on the panel, but also on this in this session, got any experience of that or any comment on that particular issue? While you're thinking about that, there is, thanks Wendy for your question, which is to Paul, I imagine. Do you have problems with deer on your fields?
Hi, Will. I don't know if you can hear me. It's Bill.
Yes.
Hi. Yeah, so this has been a thing, particularly where we've been trying to get permission on small farming setups where they aren't entitled to permitted development, and they've been looking to do systems that are obviously clearly got loads of ecological and biodiversity value, and it's been a bit nuts that we've been then subjected to this change of landscape character thing. So I think on larger holdings where you've got you haven't got an issue about trying to get buildings and things to support your system, it's less of a problem what you choose to do with the landscape more generally, and obviously planting trees is clearly beneficial.
Yeah, thanks for that, Bill. That's a really interesting issue. It hasn't come up that much actually in our discussions. I don't know if any of my colleagues on the project remember any other instances of that. No, but that's certainly noted, so thank you. Can I bring in Wendy's question here to Paul, I imagine? Do you have problems with deer in your fields?
Hi, Wendy. Yeah, we do have a resident roe deer population. And we find that we just have to put tree guards on everything. That's why it was quite nice to find that thing with the willow pegs that we did, and we could just put them in and not have to bother with tree guards and things. So it was a nice cost avoidance scheme, and we quite like to do a bit more of that.
Thanks, Paul. There's another question. Do you subdivide the fields further, i.e. tree lanes? Or do you graze the full 3 to 4 acres in one move, including the laying hens?
Yeah, well, so what we've done, we've moved from 3-day moves with sheep because we just found that they were nailing everything pretty hard, and our grow back period was a lot longer. So we've gone on to 1-day shifts with cattle, and then we leave it 3 days for a hatch of bugs and maggots to appear in the cow pats, and then the chickens come in, the laying chickens come in the eggmobile and sanitize the pasture, and then we get lots of lovely free-range eggs.
Fantastic. There's actually quite a few questions coming in here, which is great, but I think we do probably need to actually move on into the discussion part of our session. Maybe I could ask Paul whether you have the chance between now and the end of our time together, if you could maybe sort of answer some of those questions in the chat. I think that might be.
Yeah, I'll get my good lady wife to, she's a bit of a technician to help me out. Okay. Yeah, I'll do it.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
And yeah, so we'd like to move on really to more of an interactive discussion part of this session, and address 3 of the key issues that have been coming up through our consultation so far. And these are going to be addressed by Stephen Briggs, Helen Chesshire, and Ben Raskin in turn. And we've got roughly 20 minutes maximum to talk about each of those. And Stephen, Helen, and Ben will be presenting what that issue is about, but then asking for your sort of input, ideas, perspectives, and questions on that. Just in terms of how we manage that, because there's quite a few of us in this session, can I ask that, again, you, if you'd like to input and speak, could you first just put a one-liner kind of comment, or if it's a question in the chat column, so that Helen and Ben and Stephen can actually bring you in turn to actually to speak to the issue being discussed, if that's okay. Something else we'd quite value is if you want to, you don't know insistence on this, of course, but if you'd like to just put in the chat just a quick summary of your interest in or experience of practicing agroforestry, maybe something about why you haven't done it if that's the case, why you haven't sort of wanted to implement agroforestry, any sort of perspectives like that. And we'd like to capture those. And again, this will all be feeding into the evidence that we pull together in terms of the building blocks for a future agroforestry scheme. So thank you. And over to Stephen, first of all, on this, the first of the three key issues that we would like to talk about.
Well, thanks very much, and morning to everybody. So, as well as already mentioned, one of the first things we sort of want to look at is really how ELM, the environmental land management program as is, can be structured in a way that it can reward both farmers already doing agroforestry and those that are looking at implementing agroforestry. Clearly, there are slightly different perspectives for those that have already been doing it for some time, for those that are considering it in relation to advice and guidance and also financial support. So, as shown on the slide there, really what we want to try and consider, and would be interested in people's comments, is for those farmers who have already really been already involved in agroforestry that are on this session, how can they be rewarded under the environmental management program? And for those farmers equally that are interested in agroforestry, or land managers, landowners that are interested in agroforestry, how do they see the interaction with those farmers and those land managers to gain more information and guidance, and how do they see the ability to reward those farmers for their activity? So it's a bit of sort of, I suppose, a bit of an open session, and we're very interested to hear what some of your comments are in the chat. I suppose a starter for 10 might be along the lines, without wanting to sort of pre-populate, government's position on ELM under the sustainable farming incentive is a very light touch in terms of advice, whereas the provision of advice and guidance through the higher tier programs in local nature recovery and landscape nature recovery will be a greater provision. And so a sort of starter for 10 might be, well, should agroforestry establishments sit in one or more of those different programs, and equally farmers that are already practicing agroforestry, should they be rewarded through SFI or through local nature recovery or landscape nature recovery? Sort of discuss, I suppose. Does anybody have any particular thoughts on that from their own experiences? By all means, I mean, there is 58 people on this call, but if people have got a particular views on this, do unmute yourself and chip in, or feel free to type something into the chat box. And there's some messages coming in. Let me just have a look at those. So Simon said SFI seems to be more focused on proactive rather than productive agroforestry, e.g. £10 per year per tree for as a payment level. Simon, do you want to elaborate on that at all? And then there's some comments here about the EIA regs under the Forestry Act and whether agroforestry is classified as forestry or not. I think it's fairly clear on that one, in that agroforestry is, if it's on agricultural land, that land retains its agricultural status. It doesn't necessarily get a land use classification change into forestry. But then equally, agroforestry can be practiced on forestry status land, which would retain its forestry status. So it rather depends on where your starting point is. So just reiterating that question, I suppose those farmers who have already been already planted trees, should they and how can they be rewarded under the environmental land management program? Yeah, John, please unmute and chip in.
Yeah, morning, Stephen. Yeah, I guess it's a kind of bit of an historical problem that lots of previous schemes have, the funding has been aimed at making a difference rather than reporting, rather than sort of rewarding people who have already made that difference. So I think there's a bit of baggage to overcome. I mean, for me, the easiest way, I think, would be, all the previous discussions that I attended yesterday were all about the need for really good farmer-led advice. Absolutely seeing things in the flesh, hearing people's experiences of what's worked are absolutely key and are going to be critical to the uptake of agroforestry, I think. So I think people who've got schemes up and running, who are prepared to share that with people in person or in print or social media, that's where I think we should really start rewarding them and rewarding them well. I think there was a comment at one session yesterday about, do we need more professional advisors who are experts in agroforestry? And I think the comment from the speaker was they felt what they really needed was more farmers to be able to lead other farmers in that process. So I think for me, a really good starting point would be to reward those people who've got good schemes in the ground, who are prepared to share their expertise with others.
Thanks, John. That's really helpful. I'm just looking down through some of the questions that have been put in here. Simon has made a comment here, actually, in relation to what we've done on our own farm as part of one of the monitor farms. And if people can see that, he said presumably our alley cropping systems are managed, and we don't get elm support for the infield as infield trees. Well, no, currently we don't. We do, curiously, we get support through countryside stewardship for the understory element, the pollen and nectar mixture beneath the trees, but we don't get any funding for the trees themselves. Although, if looking in the timeline for elms rollout, there is certainly written into that an SFI, Sustainable Farming Incentive standard on agroforestry, which is proposed for rollout, I think, in 2025. Unless my memory escapes me. So there's certainly an intention or a desire by elms and by Defra to have an agroforestry standard. But I think one of the things they're grappling with at the moment is how they reward the establishment versus how they reward schemes that or programs or agroforestry that's already in place. So there's two elements here. One is how do we provide that advice, and John's made some really interesting comments here about leveraging existing agroforestry sites for the benefit of those farmers and land managers that are interested in agroforestry. And then secondly, how do we support and reward both people establishing agroforestry and those that are already doing it? And it could be that, and I'll be interested in people's comments, it could be that the Sustainable Farming Incentive rewards agroforestry that is already in place because it doesn't need as much support and advice, and that new planting or new establishment of agroforestry is supported under a local nature recovery tier, a slightly higher tier, which can provide more guidance and more advice and different levels of funding. I'll be interested to hear what people think about that. So Karen, you've raised a point here about the difficulty for everyone is the 1967 Forestry Act. Do you want to, excuse me, unmute and just elaborate on that a little bit?
Oh, okay, that put me on the spot. Thank you. Yeah, hi, Karen from the Forestry Commission. I think I was a Woodlands officer and now the business development advisor for the South East, and some of the agroforestry schemes I come across, it's really hard for it to fit in our grant system and comply with UKFS and the Forestry Act. So that, and it, like you said earlier, it's about density of trees, also the species and the fact that the permanency of it. So that is the difficulty in this interim period while they review UKFS, which I think will be done by the end of 2022. Yeah, that's all I was saying. I was just sort of highlighting why it's difficult. We all want it and want to support it, but we haven't got the tools to do it with.
It's an interesting dilemma, and for many years agroforestry has sort of fallen between a rock and a hard place. It's not between agriculture and forestry, and it isn't forestry as in its traditional sense, but equally it isn't agriculture in its traditional sense. And you're right in that the agroforestry doesn't currently fit any of the potentially doesn't fit any of the forestry grant processes or the Forestry Act, although I think there is potential in the England Woodland Creation offer for agroforestry to fit in the right way, but it will be how it's regulated and managed. And I think some farmers are nervous about permanent land use change from agriculture to forestry. Yeah.
So the new creation offer is amazing. And yes, there is scope for agroforestry when we're talking about shores and hedgerows, as long as it's 20 metres wide and so on. So there is scope for whole systems in that, fitting it in like that, but actually having it in the main field of production is tricky.
Thanks very much for the comments. Okay. Really helpful. Anthony, you've raised an issue here about market, and would a method of support be better going forward in the form of market drivers rather than, I suppose, granting carrots or sticks? Do you want to say anything about how you see markets functioning? If you're able to unmute yourself.
Hi, Stephen. My point really was just that if you a lot of the reasons not to go into agroforestry are based on no real products coming out of it that provide a cash income to the farm. Certainly with fruit and things, it's like to try and fit that in as an extra business on your farm is quite difficult, and maybe some market stimulation and some creation of cooperatives, that kind of thing, maybe some wood chip cooperatives, that some shared use of chipping facilities, that kind of thing might actually be a more useful way of getting people to incentivizing people to add agroforestry into their world.
Thanks, Anthony. That's really helpful and useful comments. Certainly, I'm aware that there is activity around nuts and nut trees, and some interest in collaboration to create a supply structure of both nuts into markets. And I think also we'll start to see some collaboration and activity around carbon as well. So when you say no outputs, I mean, obviously there's natural capital outputs, there are fruit, nut, timber outputs, but equally there are carbon outputs as well. I think that might start to coalesce and be able to sort of gather some inputs around that sort of market stimulation. Okay, so just pulling it back to the comments here. so John's made a comment here around future payments being related to annual maintenance costs of pruning, root pruning, guarding, etc. And they could be potentially, as well as the understory, they could be funded through the program. So it might not be just the tree element; it might be the management, maintenance that we might be looking to think about in terms of SFI or landscape recovery or local nature recovery funding through ELMS. So thank you for that. Useful point. Claire, you've got a comment here in relation to rewarding existing systems, especially with regard to hedges. Do you want to elaborate on that? If you want to unmute yourself.
I was just referring to, in the past, there's been incentives to plant new hedges, which has then perversely incentivized the removal of arguably much more valuable old hedges. So extending that to existing agroforestry systems by not rewarding existing systems, we run a risk that it looks better to pull out maybe 10-year-old trees and put in new ones, which would obviously be quite perverse.
Yeah, I think thank you. That's a really important point. Programs that are based on effectively additionality, moving from point A to point B by improving things. Actually, we can see a lot of benefit in retaining what's already there, so making sure that that's built into the ELM program. And I guess that's a precursor to having this particular slot within this workshop, is how do we reward what's gone before and what's already there. And there's been some very useful comments in the chat, so thank you. I'm just looking at the time, and we should probably move on to the next session. So thank you for your input there. I'll hand over to I'll mute myself and hand over to Helen, who's going to take us through the next session.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, so obviously the slide has now come up, and we have already touched on some of the points on here. But my question really is, how permanent is or should agroforestry be? And this is, as Stephen alluded to, this is seen as quite a barrier to many farmers. It's that perception of it being a land use change. And probably, as we all know, there's very little, if any, integration between current agricultural and forestry policy. And obviously, when we were within CAP, agricultural was an EU competency, whereas forestry was an individual country policy. So there was this natural barrier and divide between it all, and regulation alongside that. So, our question to you really is, this must change if agroforestry is going to be taken up at scale. So, should trees in agroforestry systems be treated as forestry or as a long-term rotational agricultural crop? But I think when you're thinking about that question, I'd like you to think about not just the sort of alley cropping that's on the image there, and that's the type of thing that Stephen has done with great success on his farm in Cambridgeshire, but it's also the stuff that we've just heard from Paul. It's that boundary agroforestry, it's those hedgerows, it's those 5-metre hedgerow browsing hedgerows, it's those shelter belts, but it's also those infill trees, whether they're in those small cages or whether they're extensive wood pasture. So, that's a really diverse mix of different agroforestry systems. So how do we, regulate those, and how do we deal with those permanency issues around that? So it's great to have Karen on the call, and, thank you for your contributions to date in terms of just saying how difficult this is going to be, and that, things like the Forestry Act, things like EIAs are there for good reason within the forestry world. So how do we mix and match with agroforestry between the forestry requirements and the agricultural requirements? And then on top of that, agroforestry is a long-term investment. And although some of the environmental benefits can be delivered quite quickly, in terms of the starting of improvements in water integration into the soil, or quite quickly that hedgerows and trees will start to give some sort of shade. But obviously, it is a long-term investment. So how can tenants actually be engaged in this? And we have got Stephen on the line, who is a tenant, so we know it can be done. And there's some really interesting models like the one that's been taken forward at Dartington. But it's also seen as a major barrier. So yeah, that's my bit. I will do my best to see what's in the chat, but if anybody has got a particular point they want to make straight away, then do shout and take yourself off mute. Yes, so John, yeah, I'll refer to my colleague, John Tucker. Have you probably got a point to make, John?
Yeah, thanks, Helen. Just to kick the debate off. So I think the EIA regulations, I think are there and are created for a good reason. But I think it's how we are using them, interpreting them, and particularly how we're helping landowners to use them in the right way, I think really needs looking at. So for me, there are two key things when anybody's thinking about any sort of afforestation, agroforestry, woodland, or whatever. It's to look at the site that you're on, all the things about it, soils, archaeology, are there room for the trees, etc., and the objectives that you're seeking to fulfill with that planting. And in effect, if you're using the EIA regulations in the right way, that will help guide you through those processes. So I think they are, on the one hand, they can be really helpful, but I just think they've become this real, I feel they've become this real stick at the moment to almost make life as difficult as possible for people to get through the process. And I really think we need to change that mindset. We need to do all the right due diligence, but there needs to be much more support and help for landowners to get them through that process. And just, I mean, to me, it's really unclear legally, does agroforestry actually fall within the EIA regulations of the 1967 Forestry Act? I think in many cases they don't, but that's another issue.
Thanks, John. That's really helpful. And, I think that the first point you were making about the importance of those sites, the sort of the discipline that an EIA process requires you to go through is essential in making sure we do get the right tree in the right place for the right reasons. But I think perhaps some of what you were saying is that need for better understanding of what the EIA process is, better help and advice, and maybe a review of some of the rules in the context of some types of agroforestry. So it'd be good to know from anybody else, does this just link back to this big need for better advice and sharing of expertise, or does it actually require some sort of legal changes, or does it require that EIAs are looked at slightly differently for agroforestry? Does anybody else? I don't know whether, Karen, you've got anything further to add. I don't want to put you on the spot, but you've already made yourself known in the session. I don't know if you've got...
The Forestry Commission has very recently reviewed how they apply the EIA, although they can't change what is law, so that it's still within the parameters for the woodland creation grants. So can't really add any more than that, although, as you say, they're in place for a really, really good reason.
So so obviously some aspects of agroforestry clearly feel like they're an extension of agricultural systems, but so could they be regulated under agriculture, and does that get around some of the the fear of the land use changes? I'm not sure if anybody on the call has got any particular feelings about that or expertise in that area, or should we be very ambitious and demand that agroforestry is a land classification in its own right? Or would that be too much of a blockage to actually enable it to be taken up?
Helen, sorry to dominate the.
Feel free.
Just an interesting comments that we've been working on a scheme in Cambridgeshire, and I think there were fruit trees that were in that were classed as not being part of the EIA process because they were regarded as agricultural crops, but nut crops were regarded as agroforestry, and then they were looking at them as part of that EIA process. So it's really unclear about what's agriculture, what's forestry, what act actually has to apply. you know, even within the Forestry Act and the EIA regulations themselves, somebody commented earlier about size thresholds. The wording around those size thresholds is really unclear. And just to try and address the permanence, non-permanence debate, I really think that agroforestry, if we want the uptake that government is seeking, I think we should be making them non-permanent. But there has to be some right of replacement. If you want to take it out, that you have to put it back equal amounts somewhere else.
Thanks, John. Yes, I mean, that feels like a sort of sensible way forward, that you perhaps look at the whole farm holding as to the tree cover it has on it, rather than the actual individual trees being a permanent feature, and that allows that flexibility of farming systems around it. I mean, Daniela, would you like to talk? You've put a comment in about selling trees as carbon credits. I don't know if you want to sort of just open that up to the rest of everybody else, because obviously that does link to the permanency piece. Are you there, Danielle?
Hi, sorry, struggling. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, and we can hear you.
The sun's right in my eyes as well. Yeah, no, I came across this through a friend. Well, I only do small scale farming, so I'm below the 11-acre threshold. So everything has to, there's no grants available or anything. So, but this was my friend who had the massive farm, really, really struggling, about to sell off loads of acres. She just couldn't afford it. And she was approached by a business who said, well, we'd like to offset our carbon, the whole green their business thing when it wasn't, remotely green. And they offered her, they told her what whatever the carbon credit rate was at the time. And she was able to keep the land by them essentially buying the trees, absorbing all the carbon dioxide on the land, and encouraging her to plant more. They paid for the trees, and she kept it like that. And in a way, it was kind of, she was a bit, well, this is saying a company is obviously greener than they are, because they're still producing those carbon dioxide. But it enabled her to plant more trees on the land. She massively increased the biodiversity on the land, and she was able to use, she's done loads of mushroom growing now with the wood chip she produces, and it's enabled her to diversify. But it's obviously, it's not within any kind of the regulations or anything like that. It was just a way for her to make money from having trees on the land. So I thought I'd add it. So there you go.
Yes, thank you, Daniela. I think it must be quite a, I grew up on a farm, but we don't have the farm anymore. It must be very confusing with all these sort of new opportunities and people approaching farms to wanting to offset their carbon. I think it's quite a complex and quite, perhaps at one angle, it's quite a scary situation at the moment. I mean, I think agroforestry has a role certainly in carbon sequestration, and whether it should be focused more on enabling individual farmers to actually meet net zero themselves, because obviously farmers are going to come under pressure to do that. And then perhaps see whether that external market exists in certain situations. But as you say, it's very complex and does feel slightly like it's unregulated at the moment to a degree. I'm also going to pick on, we've got Tim Downs on the call as well, who is one of our other monitor farms and who is obviously practicing silvopasture in the lowland situation. So I don't know, Tim, would you like to unmute yourself? You've mentioned again Mark Shepherd's book, and talking about the sort of the size of your farm and being able to farm, putting the trees in to help with that vertical expansion of your farm size. I don't know if you want to add anything, Tim.
Morning, Helen. Yes,
Hello.
we're lucky enough to visit the Acres Conference in America and hear Mark Shepherd speak in person. Fascinating chap. Came back with his book, read that a number of times, and lo and behold, we're now agroforestry practitioners, following Stephen and various other speakers as well, and learning from yourself. So we've planted 3 different small paddocks and fields with agroforestry trees, and managing them in different ways, learning from the process. Got about 400 trees now within the periphery, and actually down the centre of the field. So I think John's come to see them as well. A lot of people have been to see them, and whether they should be classified differently, this certainly should be acknowledged by a lot of these new schemes and rewarded by these new schemes, because the biodiversity increasing mechanism is been researched and proven. So we're using them for medicating the cows, and also shelter, lots of different benefits. So we'd encourage others to do the same.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, so I think it was also, I think Simon makes a good point, which, you know, I think Tim talking about his scheme and hearing about Paul's and people knowing about the sort of thing that Stephen does, is that it's so there's not one size will fit all. And so Simon, if you want to just unmute yourself and just sort of go into a bit more detail about your concerns if we try to make it one size fits all.
Hi, Helen. Yeah, I just thinking about the sort of options by context aspect of agroforestry. To me, just seems like it's inherently impossible to put a blanket classification on it, and if you do so, you will reduce the sort of the good aspect of agroforestry, which is the sort of highly variable and site-specific nature of it, or it can, at least it can be. And I think that you'd end up with these sort of broad classifications of like, oh, here's this specific sort of technology, if you like, of an agroforestry practice, and you have to just replicate it exactly if you want to get funding. And that might not be appropriate. You sort of copy and pasting things onto different environments where it might not be suited. Yeah, that's my concern.
Yeah, it's a good point. Thanks, Simon. And it's that balance, isn't it, by making sure that Elm allows for that flexibility, which I think Will pointed out right at the beginning, you know, that every farm is different and what will be appropriate for one won't be for another. And you also need to make sure that you're not putting trees where they're going to have negative consequences. So it's that balance. And I think when Elm set out, we were all very excited that farmers were going to be given this sort of flexibility, but be rewarded by the public goods that they were delivered. And as Elm has been designed, it feels like it's becoming much more rigid. So I think we've got some battles to be had, I think, there to make sure that we're obviously really pushing that there should be a sustainable farming incentive standard for agroforestry, and that there should be lots of support for agroforestry in local nature recovery, which would appear to be, from the recent announcements, much more option-based and much more like countryside stewardship. So I think we've really got to keep on emphasising the importance of that flexibility. But obviously at the same time, there needs to be that framework to make sure that we do get the right trees in the right places, the right reasons. So yeah, so it's going to need somebody much cleverer than me to know all the answers. And then I'm very conscious of time as well, but Anthony has just made a point as well. So I don't know if you would like to just sort of perhaps finish this session by unmuting yourself, Anthony. That's following on from the point that Daniela made about carbon.
Hi, sorry, it's really just following on from my previous comment in Stephen's session and about creating this market system to reward farmers for agroforestry rather than it just being a government subsidy. It seems to me that government subsidies are quite unwieldy, and if you can curate markets, then maybe we can get the outcomes that we want and the buy-in that we want, without having to deal with such a rigid system.
Thank you. And yes, and I think Nick has just put a point in that he's sort of agreeing with Simon that, you know, we've already had so much harm done as a result of subsidies, so that we need to make sure that we need to look at how we do support farmers in other ways, such as the routes to market, which, you know, again, with agroforestry, the differences in scale when you're producing either timber or fruit, it does require a new market structure. So that definitely needs to be going alongside any sort of support for those, ideally the actual delivery of those public goods, which is what Elm is meant to be focusing on. So I think, well, I've probably come to the end of my 20 minutes with that. So obviously, please keep putting questions and thoughts about this topic into the area as we move on to the final section. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. And indeed, yeah, we've got 1/3 issue to talk about, which Ben Raskin's going to introduce. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Will. And yeah, I mean, Helen, I think your section actually set me up perfectly as we moved on to the carbon and things. So this bit really is about looking at the options, the relationships, the sort of how it plays between public versus private finance for agroforestry, and to understand how, I guess, particularly new plantings might be supported, we need to understand what the benefits the trees are bringing. So they'll obviously have a benefit to the farming system. So for instance, they might increase meat or milk yields through shade, shelter, browse. They might reduce pesticide fertilizer bills. They should increase your overall profitability, as I think Simon just pointed out in the chat. Typically 30% or more when you include trees. And the farm system and the farm business should also become more resilient, not least because in many cases you get a marketable tree crop from that system. So if that was the whole picture, then you'd expect farmers to foot the whole bill. It's it's something that improves the system, improves their resilience and profitability. And as we know, a lot of pioneering farmers are already doing that. Helen Browning, who I work with at Eastbrook, most of the trees that we've been planting have been funded by the farm business, with one exception, which was a woodland creation grant. But we also know that these trees are going to deliver a whole range of public goods: clean air, water, increased biodiversity, soil health, carbon sequestration, and so on. So given this really complex picture of rewards to farm, to farmer, to nature, society, what is the best way to support it? If we leave it to farmers to fund it entirely, I think we will get agroforestry. We've seen it happening, but it will probably be slow, and it will probably take longer than the climate emergency requires. But what are the costs that are most appropriate and what are not appropriate for public finance to cover? I don't know, is planting a riparian buffer different to planting a nut orchard? They'll both be delivering significant public goods, but the buffer may have a minor positive financial impact on the farm business, while a nut operation, should in time bring an income if it's done well. So alongside the ELM process in England, there's this explosion of carbon and biodiversity offsetting opportunities. Should this replace government funding or sit alongside it is sort of the question, I guess, particularly. Or how can the two complement each other to really push that uptake of agroforestry in England? There's already been a bit of discussion around carbon. So we know that the carbon sequestration potential of trees is real. It's not always easy to measure. And is a coppice tree, is that still sequestering carbon? Well, not if you burn what you're producing, but if you're making stuff out of it, it might do. So and how many farms are actually currently carbon neutral themselves, and therefore even in a position to start selling their carbon off to others? Can we even measure whether our farms are carbon neutral? There's tools out there that are attempting to do that, but I don't think science really is yet in a position for us to fully understand all of that. So currently the English government has left the doors, I think, wide open for private and public support to sit alongside each other. Clearly, the current government, I think, would quite happily let private finance pay for everything. I'm not convinced that is risk-free or would not also lead to perverse outcomes. We're already seeing upland farms being bought out for rewilding, which I'm not sure is the best route for a lot of these things. So what does it mean in practice for them to sit alongside each other And so, yeah, interested in your thoughts. Also interested, you know, and I see quite a few farmers on the call, some of whom we've heard from already, but, you know, have any of you used private funding? You know, we have one example of someone selling a carbon. You know, there is a real risk of either not getting a good price at the moment because it's unregulated, or tying yourself into some long-term carbon deal that, you know, is either not a good deal or unfeasible. You know, I'm not convinced that the current woodland offer is suitable, particularly for smaller scale agroforestry plantings. We looked at it for Eastbrook, and I was just really put off by the spreadsheet application form of however many worksheets it had, and you know, it just made me feel physically sick, if I'm honest. So, you know, I think while there is a risk of oversimplifying, I think if we keep it as complicated as it is at the moment, no one's going to apply for it. You know, that's why the Woodland Trust support works. It's because there's guidance and it's relatively simple. So yes, so that's my introduction, and I mean, either from, I think Anthony's point about stimulating the market, I think is really valid. You know, we're looking at nuts and things particularly, and I think, you know, there's a lot. I've come across lots of farmers planting nuts. I think we might even have Guy Singh Watson on the call who's doing that. You know, what's required to push us over the edge, to get us collaborating, you know, to really have a significant UK nut production. You know, what is it? Is it that market stimulation, or, you know, is it planting the trees we need help with? Is it the management? So yes, any thoughts, comments, suggestions?
Ben, it's Guy. Can you hear me?
Yeah, come in.
Yeah, I just thought I'd just tell you what we planted about 30 acres, mostly with walnut and hazel last year in an agroforestry system, funded really out of my pocket. This year I thought I'd go wider, and as you said, it made you feel physically sick looking at the publicly funded options. I had a similar reaction, and anyway, came up with the idea of if one of our customers recommended us to someone else, we got a new customer, which generally costs anywhere from between 50 and 100 quid to recruit a customer, that we would pay them. I think I can't remember quite what we promised, whether I think it started off as 15 quid and maybe it's gone up to 25 quid. Sorry, we would pay that much. Actually, we pay them 15 quid. That's right. We pay the new customer 15 quid, and we would put another 15 quid to one of our supplying farmers to plant a tree under an agroforestry system. And the sums I did was that would, under the system we were proposing, would cover the cost of planting and maintaining it through to its starting to produce nuts. And I have to say, people haven't been beating down my door to do it. I thought that would be, you know, it would be, I'd actually have no trouble at all. But people, I think most people, my feeling, are just sort of sitting on their hands, you know, waiting to see what scheme will come up. I think the idea that they're going to be able to sell carbon, and this is going to, under my system, they retained any carbon credit. However, there is the danger that I'm sure there are people in the audience who know much more than this, that is by going ahead and doing it, you would then, because it's already done, and the history of Defra is that they only ever pay for additionality, that you've lost that potential. So I think the problem, just from the farmers I've spoken to, is perhaps they partly feel that I don't quite know what I'm doing, which would be fair enough, and then the risks are too high. But I think probably even larger than that is that they're waiting to see, you know, what money is going to be available, and they're fearful of missing out on that by going ahead now, which I think is perfectly reasonable and sensible, actually. Unfortunately, the unintended consequence of making promises but, you know, not actually fulfilling them, I suppose, on our government's part. The encouraging side of it is that we have a list of customers waiting, you know, who want to sponsor planting trees. So that's great. I mean, you know, we have I don't know, on our customer database is probably 150,000 customers. So we've got quite a big pool to draw from. But it does look like we would be able to plant maybe 5,000 trees a year under this scheme. And it seems like a win-win you know, the customer feels good, the farmer gets gets the opportunity to get into agroforestry and reduce their dependence on animals, and we give less money to Google and Facebook, which would be lovely.
And are you linking those trees into you know, buying the walnuts back from them at this stage, or at the moment is it just a tree planting?
No, I've left the carbon trading and the sale of the walnuts, that, you know, we'll just sort that out, or certainly the sale of the walnuts, hazelnuts, chestnuts, hopefully as well, at a future date. But my anticipation is that we either me individually, but hopefully a cooperative of local growers in South Devon, will buy the harvesting and processing machinery, which is surprisingly affordable and available, because there is such a history of moderate-sized nut production, mainly in Italy. The equipment is out there, I'm pretty sure, anyway.
Yeah. Thanks, Guy.
I mean, when it comes, and stop me if this is not interesting, but I mean, the harvest is a worry. I mean, when you go into anything new, there's so many risks, aren't there? And they're a long way out. And, you know, I suppose at the moment, by planting last year, we're just trying to sort of narrow down the parameters on costs. And I did visit some walnut producers in France this autumn, and kind of starting to get a feeling about the harvesting. And, you know, there is just so much to learn, you know, to turn this into an economically viable enterprise. I mean, all the sort of agronomists that I've spoken to, I don't think there's any doubt that the nuts will grow in our climate and in our soils, and I don't think the system's wrong. You know, actually harvesting them is a bit of an issue. We're not going to be able to sweep them off the ground in a system that involves livestock being in the field, so it's going to have to be a shake and catch method, which is done in certain areas of the world, I think, but is perhaps a little less conventional and might be higher cost.
So it really, what I mean, from what I can gather from what you were saying, Guy, and also from Karen and Stephen in the chat, is it's, you know, the thing that actually is holding people back is the uncertainty of what options there might be. So some people are just going ahead and doing it, but a lot of people, even where they think it's a good idea, are kind of waiting to see whether there's a you know, a better deal.
That's certainly my experience. You know, I've just had peripheral. We had a meeting last year where I think about 15 farmers came, and I've just had more informal chats with half a dozen farmers this year, and the only one who's going ahead planting 10 acres is the person who, they just wanted to do it anyway, you know, for their own personal, you know, environmental, you know, it's just something they wanted to do. And I don't think we've got beyond that. And I can completely understand someone who is really looking at it from a hard-nosed commercial point of view. You know, the risks are high, aren't they? And as previous speakers were saying, they're giving up options, you know, opportunity costs on their land. You know, you're committing something for a long, long time. You know, that is, if you're not kind of emotionally committed to it, I can see that you know, and you're just thinking about the money, especially if you're thinking in the long term. I can understand people's reluctance. I mean, I can put forward an argument, you know, even based on half or even a third of, you know, what conventionally would be expected in terms of yields, which suggests that it's a, you know, really good prospect. But we'll wait and see. It was a bit depressing visiting the actual walnut growers. You look up on the internet the price of walnuts, and, you know, €5 a kilo seems to be, you know, a pretty average price throughout Europe. And you go and visit a grower, and they're working like hell to sell them for £3, at which point it does become a bit more questionable. So I guess pricing is an issue, but.
Yeah, although, you know, Simon just pointed out in the chat as well, you know, the nut market is growing, and we're, you know, nut consumption is increasing, and at the moment we import everything. So, you know, there's got to be opportunities there, I think.
I feel very confident of that. However, I'm a financially secure, you know, older farmer who can take that sort of view. I think for people who don't have that financial cushion, you know, just sort of speculating on something is, you know, I can imagine would be pretty scary.
So in terms, you know, it's interesting in terms of, I guess, in terms of us feeding back to through the Elms project, you know, it's almost that they just need to get on with it. And, you know, where the money comes from to some extent, I mean, there is there is, I think, a nervousness about some of the private funding, and particularly the carbon. I think the biodiversity is probably less controversial because it's easier to show an increase in biodiversity than it is to prove carbon sequestration, probably.
Actually, could I just, I mean, in terms of funding, I was approached by quite a wealthy, quite elderly woman who just desperately wanted to buy 10 acres of land and see it planted with nuts. So if there's anyone on this call who would like to buy 10 acres of land and plant it with nuts with this woman, I can put them in touch. So just, I mean, I think there's so much enthusiasm for it, and potential for sort of private finance from people who do want to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. And as you say, people who just want to get on with it.
So yeah, I think so. So I'm getting a sense from most people, I think, that there's no conflict necessarily between public and private funding. There's a lot of uncertainty and confusion about what might be available, when it might be available. You know, one of the challenges of the current options with the England Wood and Creation offer is that it specifically excludes agroforestry in a lot of systems, or you know, bringing stock and farming in. So you know, I know we're promised new agroforestry bits soon, and I guess you know, it seems to be that just you know, quicker we can get something that at least supports something, even if it doesn't support everything. And I guess you know, the public funding might be better focused, certainly in terms of just tree planting, towards you know, things like riparian buffers, and whereas you know, something that is a more commercial crop, it might be that the market stimulation option is better, or just money for the tree planting and not the management. I don't know. What other comments we got? A comment, we got a 5-minute warning. Okay, so we probably should wrap this one up. A good guy, many farmers waiting. Yeah, they've been disadvantaged by Defra for being ahead of the game. It's hard, isn't it? And I do think as farmers we do need to get on with it, and even if it is just planting a few trees and starting to understand what those trees do, you know, even if you're not committing big areas, you start, you know, we certainly found at Eastbrook, you know, we've slowed down our rate of planting because we want to learn more from those first trees that we put in. So the sooner you put those first trees in, the more, you know, the more ahead of the game you are when you start to expand. And John, blended finance can work, but relying on it for 100% of funding would be a slippery slope. Public funding should be used for some sort. So yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm going to hand back to Will just to wrap up the session, but that's been really engaged and useful. And Karen, thank you. Big engagement campaign planned. Excellent. I look forward to seeing it. Over to you, Will.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ben, and thanks everybody. Yeah, I agree with you, Ben. That's been a really great discussion on that particular topic, but also the other two that we've been talking about. And in a sense, it's brought us around to where we started, that there is tremendous interest out there. And, you know, there's a real desire to get on with it, really, in terms of a support mechanism to make agroforestry much more accessible and feasible for more farmers and growers. So thanks again. Just to quickly summarize kind of next steps with our project, because well, basically we've got one final regional workshop to have, the 6th of the series. So this is going to be hosted by Tim Downs, who's on the call and spoke earlier. Unfortunately, we didn't fit it in before Christmas because of COVID disruption, but we're really hoping to be able to reschedule that. And then after that, there'll be, you know, synthesis of the findings from the 6 workshops, and indeed we'll include, you know, the discussion points and ideas that have come up in this session as well. So that's been tremendously helpful. And there'll be some wider consultation happening. So it's not the end of the opportunity to input. And if I could just pass on to this slide, which gives our contact addresses, but there's also a link that my colleague Phil put right at the top of the chat. If you go to that, you navigate to the webpage about this project. So it's an opportunity to sign up to stay in touch with progress. Our email addresses are here, and I hope I speak for the rest of the panel to say that for any kind of questions or comments that you feel might not have been addressed, feel free to contact the relevant one of us to follow that up after this session. So I think it just remains for me now to thank again my colleagues on the panel, Helen, Ben, Stephen, and Paul. Thanks for your contributions, and especially thanks to everybody who's joined us this afternoon, has inputted, been hearing ideas. Thanks for your interest. And yeah, we really look forward to being in touch with as many of you who want to be part of this process going forward. So thank you.